Well, let's bring in Pedro Antunes to the conversation. Pedro is the chief economist with the Conference Board of Canada, a frequent guest right here on the program. Pedro, always good to see you. Thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So the market's already reacted to the announcement today. Both the Dow and the NASDAQ quickly losing ground earlier, right before closing when the news was announced. The TSX also ending the day down. Beyond those impacts, how immediate are we going to feel the pain of these tariffs in Canada?
You know, I mean, it's really hard to imagine what's going to happen at the borders just starting tomorrow. But certainly when we use our economic models and tools to look at these impacts, we can't tell on a day-to-day basis, but, you know, we have quarterly models and they do suggest that there's going to be some strong impacts. You know, we're going to see essentially trade across the border shut down, I think, for a little while, especially for manufactured goods until we, you know, figure out what the end game on this is, whether these tariffs are going to be permanent. I still strongly believe that these are, you know, kind of part of that negotiating tactic, part of the, you know, pushing for demands for other things, and very hopeful that these things will not last because they would be extremely painful here for Canada's economy.
Yeah, although to hear from Donald Trump, he says these tariffs are coming in because he wants to bring business and investment to the United States. What do you make of that argument?
Well, I think this is a repeat of what we saw in 2016. I mean, even before he came into his first term, there was the big talk then was dissolving NAFTA. The NAFTA was the devil, and I think that did create a lot of anxiety for a lot of businesses about access to the U.S. consumer. And I know for a fact that some plants did move south. We saw production move from some plants in Montreal south of the border. You know, whether there's going to be a lot of success here, because I think this is, again, that same tactic. We're seeing a repeat. We're creating this uncertain environment. And if, let's face it, if Canadian, you know, manufacturers fear lack of access to the U.S. consumer, I mean, most of our manufacturing is going to that market. You know, they'll move production. I do fear that this time around, though, this may not work at all. This might just be, you know, a disaster with these tariffs, such big tariff applied so quickly. In a, you know, essentially a supply chain that has been built up since we've had free trade. It's been 3 decades and more. You know, to disentangle that is going to be a mess for both economies. So I don't know, you know, what's gonna happen down the road, but I don't think this is going to get, you know, attain the objectives. I think the fear of tariffs would be enough to move investment, but the actual application of tariffs is just going to create havoc.
Mm-hmm. Havoc, as you say, although, you know, I know we talk about the economic pain this is going to cause for Canada, but presumably it's also going to cause economic pain for the United States.
Yeah, well, in fact, we did do some number crunching around this, and, you know, I kept saying, I think this is going to be just as bad for the U.S., and in fact, because the U.S. is looking now to apply those tariffs not just to Canada, but to Canada, Mexico, and an additional set of tariffs on China, their economic impact is just as big in percentage terms as what we are expecting to see here in Canada, and it is sizable. You know, we're talking about, you know, from a quarterly, if the tariffs are applied for a quarter, you know, we could see GDP down 1.3% in Canada at annual rates in the quarter. Now, if the tariffs are temporary, then that would bounce back, you know, and the impact on the year wouldn't be quite as steep. But, you know, I think this is just as painful for the U.S. And if we think about what we export to the U.S., I mean, obviously for manufacturing, this is a disaster for Canada. But if you think about most of our exports, they're resources. You know, they're potash, metals, minerals, energy, of course. These are inputs into the U.S. production process. These are inputs that render the U.S. competitive and, you know, essentially allow, you know, consumers in that economy to have good products at cheaper prices. So this longer term, especially the hit to resources, this is just a disaster for the U.S. economy.
Mm-hmm. Now, Canada also says it's going to apply its own countervailing duties. You know, talk to us about how effective that strategy will be, because they want to hurt the U.S. economy to send a message to drop these tariffs.
Yeah, I think the U.S. economy is going to hurt on its own here. Certainly we can target, and I think a lot of when you look at certainly the phase one tariffs, they're targeted at specific products that we're hoping will have more impact in the U.S. for specific states, et cetera. And we're looking at products that will minimize the impact on Canadian consumers, and that is essentially by looking for things that we have substitutes for. So if we can't buy, I keep using this example, but Kentucky bourbon, let's say, then maybe we can, buy Canadian whiskey instead. And there's other sources. How much pain we can inflict, I've got to say, I don't think it's going to be a broad-based pain like we're going to feel from these, from the U.S. tariffs. Let's not forget that the U.S. about 11% of their GDP is exports. For us, it's 31%. So most of the products that they produce are for their own consumers, for their own economy. I just don't see us with the ability to inflict that much pain. I think there'll be more pain on the U.S. from the tariffs they're imposing on its partner countries, China, Mexico, and Canada. When I say partner countries, I should say trade countries, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Now, from what you say, I think when you look at a best case scenario for you, it's hoping that this is going to be a temporary measure, not a long-term one, until we see some type of course reversal here. And I'm quickly running out of time. What is your best advice for Canadians across the country right now?
Well, I mean, we're all on the edge of our seats here. This is just, phenomenal to see this happen. Again, such a close trade relationship, very, very hard to disentangle. I do think that we are seeing some positives in terms of opening up internal trade barriers, and we're seeing Canadian consumers taking action on their own here with kind of a patriotic move to more Canadian products. I think we do have to be very careful about what you're choosing in those, because much of our supply chain is really, again, very difficult to disentangle from what's produced in Canada and the U.S. So be careful on those, I would say. But let's, there's nothing we can do quickly here to alleviate the impact of what this is going to cause for a lot of manufacturers. And I think if this lasts more than a few days, we're going to see essentially job losses in sectors across Canada, especially in manufacturing.
Well, we've been told it would be an existential hit to the national economy. Pedro Antunes, thank you for this. Appreciate the time.
Oh, you're welcome. It's always a pleasure.